Adam Swift wrote the book that you guys read, and I know you read chapter 6. And one of the things that he talks about in chapter 6 is things that you don't want to have democratically decided. Democracy is a good thing. We all think it's good to vote on stuff, but there are certain things that we don't think we should vote on. And he has two examples that just run right through chapter 6 and actually the book as a whole. Whenever he's talking about choice and that sort of thing, he always has things that people should be able to decide for themselves. And just to make this concrete, in the 1930s, when the Nazis were in power in Germany, they had the power. First of all, if you were an ethnic German, you weren't allowed to marry someone who was Jewish. And moreover, if you were a certain kind of ethnic German, they might think that you were really athletic, and they might really encourage you to marry someone who was really athletic so that your babies would be really athletic. They thought that genetics determined that kind of stuff. And so in the German state during the Third Reich, frequently they were trying to control who married whom and who had sex with whom. So, and we all think that that's just a clear core case where a government was acting badly. You know, even if, and Hitler actually was elected by the Reichstag before he came into power. And so there was some element of democracy to Germany. He then had an enabling act that gave him power to just make laws unilaterally after that. But he was initially elected as Chancellor of Germany by the Reichstag. So there was an element of democracy in that. And yet the results were very, very bad because there was a lack of recognition of people's dignity or integrity or something like that. So Adam talks about not making decisions for people about both religion and sexual activity. Well, let's just talk about some basic differences between the UK and the US first. The first thing to notice about the two different countries is that the US has a codified constitution. That means there's one document called the Constitution that we can look at and say, yep, that's the set of rules that we use to run the government, okay? If the government acts without being within the Constitution, then that action is unconstitutional. The UK does not have a codified constitution. The UK Constitution, it still has a government, and the government acts in a coordinated way. Nobody knows really why. And there are rules about how the government can act. But most of those rules are either in normal, ordinary statutes or are conventions. So for example, to pass a law in the UK, the bill starts in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, and it has to be passed by both houses roughly, and it also has to have what's called the royal assent. And that means that the Queen, through commissioners, gives her permission for that law to go into effect. Now, the Queen has not withheld the royal assent since 1708, okay? That was Queen Anne who did it in 1708. And it was pretty controversial at the time. And one king early in the 20th century thought about it at one point. George V thought about it when the Irish were getting home rule. But basically, there's a convention that the Queen does not withhold the royal assent. She always lets laws go into effect once they've passed both houses of Parliament. So that's a convention. In the US, we have conventions too. We have conventions about Congress has committees, okay? We have all kinds of things that happen just because the branches find it more convenient to act that way. But the conventions aren't as critical in the US as they are in the UK. All right, codified constitution, no codified constitution. Second, checks and balances. The US has checks and balances, right? President, Congress, Supreme Court. President enforces laws, Congress passes laws, Supreme Court judges whether things fall within the laws, okay? And so, for example, the president can't appoint people to certain offices without the advice and consent of the Senate. So the Senate is a check on the president that way. The president can veto bills, and then they have to pass 2/3 of both houses of Congress to override the veto. That's a check on Congress. Supreme Court checks both of them, okay, to make sure that they're operating within the Constitution. So that's a system of checks and balances that we have in the US. The UK does not have that. The UK has what's called parliamentary sovereignty. 8 words you have to remember to know how the British government operates. What the Queen in Parliament enacts is law. 8 words. The Queen in Parliament is those 3 things I was just talking about before. The Queen, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. And whatever those 3 agree on, and the Queen doesn't say much anymore, okay, and really it's up to the House of Commons. Whatever laws the House of Commons passes are law. Okay, because there's no codified constitution, there's nothing to judge those laws against. And so as a result of that, anything is legal anytime. Now, does that mean there are no constraints on what Parliament can do? No, it doesn't, because those parliamentarians can be thrown out of office because they have elections every 5 years. So there's an electoral system that underlies it, and there are conventions that constrain what Parliament can do. But there is not a formal way of checking the House of Commons and the legislative power of the Queen in Parliament, i.e. Parliament. Okay. That's checks and balances and parliamentary sovereignty. Next, judicial oversight. We in the US are used to having strong judicial oversight. That means that the Supreme Court can say, this law is unconstitutional, and the courts can't enforce it. That doesn't remove it from the statute book. It still stays on the statute book. But the courts are no longer allowed to enforce a law once it's been found unconstitutional. And we'll be talking about an instance of that tomorrow. But that happens in the US. Again, do you suppose that can happen in the UK? What the Queen in Parliament enacts is law. So you can't have an act that's unconstitutional in the UK. Now, people use the word unconstitutional all the time here. But they usually mean that people aren't obeying the conventions. But since the conventions aren't enforced by the courts, there's no way to definitively tell. People just use that word a lot. They throw it back and forth, especially when they're really mad at each other and they're fighting about something like Irish Home Rule was a big one at the beginning of the 20th century. The Irish wanted to be able to have their own parliament, even a subordinate one to the UK parliament. And they had an act that was passed and everything. Well, people who were on opposing sides of that dispute kept saying, both sides always argued that the other side was being unconstitutional, but there was no way to tell. Okay, strong judicial oversight in the US, weak judicial oversight here. Bill of Rights in the US, here they have something called the Human Rights Act. Now that's an ordinary piece of legislation that can be repealed anytime the Parliament wants to do that, okay? So the weak judicial oversight in this country, combined with the fact that the Human Rights Act is just an ordinary law, makes human rights something that are less entrenched, and that's going to be a key word that I use for the rest of our time together today. Human rights are less entrenched here than they are in the US. And the Human Rights Act enacts what is called the European Convention on Human Rights. That was passed after World War II, and Hitler and all the bad guys in World War II had done a lot of damage to human rights. And as a result of that, a number of countries, including Germany, all got together and formed what's called the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe all agreed to abide by the European Convention on Human Rights. We'll be talking about one provision of that in a couple of minutes. But that's what they have instead of a Bill of Rights in the UK. All right, now I want to talk about a little bit of history. And what you need to know about the history of this is that religion has been a very, very divisive issue in all 4 countries of the UK, bar England, pretty much. England has pretty much been the same. Now, first I want to draw a distinction between England and Scotland on this. All through Europe, basically in the 1500s, there is this movement of trying to purify Christianity by removing churches, national churches, from the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was perceived as being corrupt, and there were monks who were misbehaving, and the Pope had authorized charging for indulgences so that you could pay money and spend less time in purgatory, and all kinds of, he did it so he could pay for the Crusades. But anyway, so there was a lot of perceived corruption in the Roman Catholic Church, and so Protestants became a separate kind of church. Henry wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn because he hadn't had a boy, and so he divorced her, but in order to do that, he had to cut off appeals to the Pope. And so he cut off appeals to the Pope and declared himself the supreme governor. Actually, he was head of the Church of England. The current title is Supreme Governor of the Church of England. And he said, we're not part of the church in Rome anymore in that respect. Basically kept a lot of the structures, but said we're not going to be part of the church in Rome. That didn't happen in Scotland. Scotland did not have a very strong monarch at the time. Instead, it had a very strong aristocracy, and the aristocrats were divided, but a lot of them wanted to be Protestants because they thought that the Roman Catholic Church was corrupt, and they followed the Calvinists in Switzerland. Okay? So they had a different Reformation, and they had a different king, and they had a different parliament at this time. So the roots of religion in Scotland are different from what they are in England. So there's a lack of divine authority for the king in Scotland. That's correct. Secondly, the internal government of the church is different because the Scots don't have bishops, and the English have bishops. Okay? The Scots have presbyteries, and everything is much more democratic in the Church of Scotland than it is in the Church of England. It tends to be pretty top-down, at least historically, in the Church of England. So let me just tell you briefly that in 1534, Charles I decided that he was going to make the Scots have the same prayer book as the English. By that time, they had the same king. And the first thing that Charles did was to say that the Scots had to have a prayer book. And that started a war that lasted 15 years. Okay, it's called the War of the Three Kingdoms. There was a civil war in England. There were wars in Ireland, there was a war with Scottish, and it was basically a war about religion. It was a war about whether the Protestants, whether the Puritans were going to be in power, or whether the monarch and the divine right of kings and all that stuff was going to carry the day. Okay? So 17th century, that's the 1600s, all these wars are fought about this, and largely between England and Scotland and England and Wales. Okay, that's what we're going to call the Scottish problem, and that gets solved later. The Welsh problem is different. From I've got the number here, 1277, the English conquered Wales. Again, we're back to Henry VIII. Henry VIII made the legal systems the same, but the Welsh church never got the support that the English church did. They never had enough competent clergy, they didn't pay the clergy very well, and so the clergy weren't very good. So most people in Wales did not belong to the Church of England. Okay, and by 1851, there are all these other churches, even more reformed than the Protestant Reformation churches, and those churches are all gaining. They have the majority of people in Wales who go to those churches. Okay, but the Church of England stays established in Wales, and there's a way that the Church of England finances itself by imposing taxes on agricultural land, and even if you weren't a member of the Church of England, you still had to pay the taxes. Now, what do you suppose happens when grain prices go down and farmers are making less money and they still have to pay taxes to the Church of England, which they don't belong to? Do you suppose they're happy about that? So in the late 19th century, now we're up to the 1890s, there are what are called tithe wars in Wales, okay? And the Welsh get very upset about the fact that they're paying these tithes, and they force all kinds of concessions from the Church of England. And eventually, in 1920, the church in Wales, the Church of England in Wales, is disestablished, okay? Church of England in England is established. That means that the monarch is the supreme governor, and we keep all that, and the bishops sit in the House of Lords and all that stuff. Finally, there's the Irish problem, okay? So we've done the Scottish problem, the Welsh problem, Irish problem. 1800, Ireland becomes part of the UK officially. It had been governed by the King or Queen of England for longer than that. But at the same time that they give up having their own parliament in Ireland, they're promised that Roman Catholics will be allowed to have the vote and will be allowed to own property and have all the advantages that non-Catholics do. They had not had those advantages while the English were ruling Ireland, while the English king was ruling and they had their own parliament. And so in 1800, with the Union of Parliaments, George III, the government promises to allow Catholics to have equal rights, and George III says no, because he thinks that his coronation oath prevents him from allowing them to have religious freedom in Ireland, okay, so that Catholics can be Catholics. So, anybody ever read the Declaration of Independence? It has a whole list of things that George III did wrong, right? Most of it is taken up with, and he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. Okay, so George III does not figure well in American history, but he also doesn't in Irish history because he welched on the promise to give the Catholics. So after 1800, you have consistent fighting back and forth with Ireland about whether they're going to be allowed to have a parliament again. And as I said before, this is one of the places where people start claiming that each side always claims that the other is being unconstitutional. In 1914, an act was passed that gave them their own legislature. That was suspended during World War I. And then after World War I, they were allowed to have their own legislature, and Northern Ireland stayed separate and remained part of the United Kingdom. They finally really became independent, Ireland did, in 1930. And when they were drafting up their constitution, the preamble of that constitution is worth reading because it talks about the Holy Trinity and the importance of the Roman Catholic Church and all kinds of stuff like that in their constitution in Ireland, okay? So that is a very religious state that believe, and up until recently they didn't have divorce. They still have very, very heavy restrictions on abortion. Ireland is a very, very religiously rooted political culture, although that's changing now. Okay, so we've now done Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and I hope I haven't been boring, but I think that gives you enough facts that you know why religion is really, really important in the UK, but why it's also really hard to solve these problems. So now let's go on to some theory stuff, and I want to read this out to you, and we're going to take it apart bit by bit. This is something that Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to James Madison. The earth belongs always to the living generation. The Constitution and the laws of their predecessors extinguished them in their natural course with those whose will gave them being. Every constitution then and every law naturally expires at the end of 19 years. If it be enforced longer, it is an act of force and not of right. Why does he think 19 years is the right number? It's a generation. He's thinking this is the length of a generation. So after 19 years, the people who passed those laws are probably dead because they had to be in their 30s or so, and the lifespan isn't that long. And so this is, by the time the guys who have passed the law, and they were all guys then, have been around 19 years, they're probably dead, and it's time for a new group to come in and make up their mind about what they want to do. Okay, James Madison doesn't agree with that. Okay, James Madison is also one of the guys who's responsible for the way the U.S. is set up. And he says, the problem is that the dead frequently made improvements and investments and things that made the world a better place for everyone to live in. And so, for example, you have to have the ability to borrow money, okay? And you might want to have longer than 19 years to pay it back, or even longer than that. And so if you're going to borrow money, like we had to do in the US from France to finance the Revolutionary War, then you have to be able to commit to not default on that debt. And that may take you longer than 19 years. Okay, so Madison says, look, you don't know what you're talking about, Thomas Jefferson. They were friends, but they disagreed about a lot of stuff. And he's like, and his response is, there are a lot of things that you need long commitments for. Now, in that paper that you read last night, I was trying to make a point about the fact that entrenchment is about pre-commitment. Now, entrenchment is what we say, what we use, the term we use when we refer to a law that it's very hard to change, okay? And for example, the UK Constitution is entrenched only in a practical political sense. There's no legal entrenchment in this country. In the US, we have a legally entrenched constitution that's very hard to change. But in entrenchment is about something that economists and political scientists call pre-commitment. So it's not, okay, so if you've got three generations, generation A, generation B, and generation C, okay? Say I'm generation A and there's generation B in between us, and that's people who are in their probably 30s right now, and you're generation C, okay? The point we were trying to make in that paper was that entrenchment is about pre-commitment, which protects you guys from generation B, okay? So I, generation A, can make a commitment to do something, and I protect generation C, that's you guys, against the guys who are in the legislature now making bad decisions based on spur-of-the-moment impulses, okay? So now what we need to decide is whether religion is something that we want to entrench, religious rights and religious interests, okay? My attempt was to show that people fight about religion. It's important enough that people are willing to have wars about it, that people in Wales were willing to have violent protests that were then called the Tithe Wars about it, that the Irish were very unhappy for a very long time about the fact that they weren't given equal civil rights because they were Roman Catholics. So my basic premise here is that religion is sufficiently important that people are willing to take big risks and fight very, very hard about it. Secondly, the reason they do that is that they're making incompatible truth claims. We already had one incompatible truth claim about the divine right of kings, right? That's a difference between the Scots and the English, okay? Before 1689, we'll say, okay? Now, in this country, to hold civil office, in order to be in the government, or an employee of the government, or attend Oxford or Cambridge, up until the mid to late 19th century, that's the 1800s, only 150 years ago, you had to swear an oath that you didn't believe in transubstantiation. Pretty crazy, eh? Okay? So, and when you get the union between the Scottish and the English Parliament, there had been those wars, and the Scots knew that they didn't have enough people to really beat the English if they were forced to do it, if they were forced into it, unless the English were divided the way that they were during the Civil War. So when that union was negotiated, one of the things that they absolutely demanded was an entrenched provision in the Treaty of Union that said that the Presbyterian Church would always be the national church in Scotland, that we would never again make them have a prayer book like we tried to do in 1637, okay? And so in the Treaty of Union, there's a provision that says that the Presbyterian Church will remain the national church of Scotland, and that its remaining so is a condition of union in all time coming, okay? So what do you suppose happens if the UK Parliament votes to abolish the Church of Scotland and replace it with something else? Well, there's a good legal argument that the Scots could say, nope, can't do that, and if you do it, we're an independent country again just automatically because the Treaty of Union doesn't count anymore, okay? That is an unconstitutional act. It hasn't happened. They've come close, but it hasn't happened. But that would be an unconstitutional act in this country. So you see, there is a constitution. It's not codified. You have to do a lot of hunting around to find it. But you can find provisions in statutes, treaties, and other kinds of places that are constitutional. Okay, so we've got incompatible truth claims. People have fought wars over them. Minorities, like Roman Catholics, nonconformists in Wales, Presbyterians in Scotland, can be badly oppressed. And temporary circumstances can lead to populist reactions against minorities. For this, all you have to do is think back to 9/11, right? After 9/11, the bombing of the World Trade Center, there was a great deal of animosity against Muslims. But what happens? Well, people don't even understand basic religious things, because one of the things that happens is, in addition to Muslims, there's another group called Sikhs. It's a mixture of Hinduism and Islam. They have gurus, and one of the things that they do is they wear turbans because they don't cut their, men wear turbans because they don't cut their hair, okay? And so everybody in the United States, a lot of people, no, let's not say everybody, everybody's bad. There were some people who were very angry with Muslims in the United States who assumed that anyone who wore a turban was a Muslim, and who attacked Sikhs even though they have very little to do with Islam anymore, okay? So you get these bad reactions like that. You get bad laws that get passed in response to these kinds of things. And so what we want to do is figure out ways to protect who? Generation C from Generation B. So what we're going to talk about is how you do that. On your handout, the first section is the provision that I was just talking about that's part of the Treaty of Union between Scotland and England. And it says, "Therefore, Her Majesty, with advice and consent of the said Estates of Parliament, doth hereby establish and confirm the said true Protestant religion and the worship, discipline, and government of this church," that is the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, "to continue without any alteration to the people of this land in all succeeding generations." Okay? The Church of Scotland is an established church. We don't have those in the United States, but it's an established church. But it's protected by this provision so that the government of the UK can't change it. And that's a rule for all time coming. And you see how it says, in all succeeding generations. So again, we're back to this protecting Generation C from Generation B disestablishing the Church of Scotland, because most of the people in Scotland are Presbyterian. Now, different kind of a solution in the next provision. This is what we have in the United States. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Okay? That's what we use in the United States. Now, there's a trick that happened in the 1950s and 60s when the Supreme Court got concerned about the fact that some states were being unfair to some religious groups. And what they did was they said, you know, even though that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, because of another amendment, the 14th Amendment, we think that applies to the state governments too. So that same provision, even though it says Congress at the beginning, it also applies to state governments. So state governments can't make a law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So what do you think that means? To say you can't have an established religion and you can't prohibit free exercise. You can't set up a national religion, so you can't have a Church of America or the Church of the United States that is part of the church, the Anglican Communion, say, or something like that. That would not be something that was possible, even though many people in the southern United States anyway at the time of the Revolution were members of the Church of England. School prayer is the big one in the United States. It says under God. You know what happens on these things sometimes? The U.S. Supreme Court dodges. They say, oh, there's a reason we can't decide that. It doesn't have to do with it. And so they've so far dodged the question of the Pledge of Allegiance. It's come up a couple of times. It does say under God, and children are required to say it in classrooms, and some people think that's unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court has found ways to not have to decide whether it is or not. And they say prayers at the beginning of sessions of Congress, and at in many state legislatures, and in city councils, and all kinds of places. A lot of these are things that people believe are symbolic and not really religious. Is it worth the time, expense, and trouble of trying to eliminate that, or do you want to let it linger on just because it's really important to a lot of people that it's important to? I mean, you've got interests in nice, clear rules, but you've also got really important interests in people's hurt feelings and stuff. And so there are a lot of people who feel like they've been pushed way, way, way out over to the side. Religion is really important to them, and if you start taking "in God we trust" off the dollar or the quarter or whatever, they'll feel really oppressed. And again, we're back to my point about how religion is really important to some people and they fight wars over it and stuff. So you have to make big decisions about whether or not you're going to start these kinds of fights that could end up ugly, like Jenny Geddes in the prayer book in Scotland. Anybody aware of any legal problems that come up about free exercise? We're off in the world of the Wild West, but when the Mormons were settling Utah, they believed in polygamy, and at one point President Buchanan sent in troops to stop them. There's also one of the very first and most important cases from the U.S. Supreme Court about religious freedom is a case about polygamy. It was a Mormon who was being penalized criminally. He was sent to jail over the fact that he had 2 wives, and he said, this is freedom of religion. Well, the Supreme Court on this one collapsed. They said, no, that's not freedom of religion, that's something different. But that's the very first time that the Supreme Court ever used the phrase wall of separation between church and state, is in that case. Okay, so they planted the seeds there. So we've got this stuff set up. Now, so we've got fairly absolute, we've got the entrenched provision in the Treaty of Union that protects the established church in Scotland so that at least it doesn't get beat up, okay? Then we've got the US case where we've got a really hard line. Now we've got a fuzzy one, is the next one. And this is the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 9. And there are 2 paragraphs to it, okay? The first one is this: everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Okay, that's a long-winded provision, but it gives lots and lots of specifics. So what does this do? Actually, there's something called apostasy in Islam, where it really is a bad thing if you go away from Islam, okay? And some Islamic groups think that's bad, and some countries have enacted that into law. So it's a bad, bad thing legally to try to change your religion away from Islam. So you have all this broad freedom. Now notice there's no non-establishment provision. Why do you suppose that is? Well, it's the European Convention on Human Rights. There are lots and lots of European countries that have established religion, so that's a bad idea. You can politically do that. But let's take a look at the second paragraph. Freedom to manifest one's religion or belief shall be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interests of public safety, for the protection of public order, health, or morals, or the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Okay, so your religious practice or belief has to be consistent with the rights and freedoms of others. Yeah. So if I have a religion that involves torturing people or something else that's really objectionable, but just hurt feelings probably isn't enough. I guess the question is that language broad enough that you would be worried about a government passing a law that restrained religious freedom because they had permission to do it from the second paragraph? They're necessary in a democratic society in the interest of public safety or for these other things. So you still have to have, those things have to be necessary in a democratic society, and that may constrain it enough. Okay? Anything else? I think we're at our 5 minutes. Yep, over it.
Thank you.